Okay, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I want to get things going. My name is Tai Ming Chong, and I'm the director of the University of California Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. I want to welcome everyone to the third Herb York Memorial Lecture. And it's my pleasure to have the distinguished guest, Dr. Arati Prabhakar, the director of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, otherwise known as DARPA, or also known affectionately as the Department of the Mad or Disruptive Scientist, who's going to be given the lecture this year. And I also wanted to recognize in attendance the family of Herb York, and especially his widow, Sybil York, and the other distinguished guests here. This lecture is in honor of Herb York by connecting his legacy. And one of the legacies is that he helped to lay down the foundations of DARPA as its first chief scientist, and to connect with the present by bringing the agency's current head to UCSD to talk about DARPA's current mission of driving technological surprise in a changing world. Besides DARPA and a few other institutions that you may have heard of, like Lawrence Livermore and UCSD, Herb was responsible for also establishing IGCC. Although, unfortunately, while Herb was a great pioneer and a great scientist, he was not known with coming up with acronyms that had any resemblance to the English language. And we're still trying to tell people what IGCC stands for. But IGCC is a University of California-wide research institute, and we're dedicated to understanding the sources of international conflict and finding ways to foster cooperation. One of the central passions of Herb when the institute was established during the tense years of the Cold War in the early 1990s was to deal with the dangers of nuclear proliferation, which was also one of his career highlights as an arms control negotiator. IGCC brings together the intellectual excellence of the University of California system to examine major global issues and offer academic and policy insights and prescriptions. Our current agenda includes a diverse range, but particularly focusing on issues such as understanding the sources of political violence and its impact on economic development, especially as it relates to terrorism, and the rise of major powers such as China and its influence on technology and innovation. IGCC is also actively involved in promoting international cooperation through dialogue. For example, over the past 20 years, we've been bringing together representatives of the major powers in Northeast Asia, North Korea, China, Russia, Japan, South Korea, and the US, to discuss some of the most pressing national security issues confronting that region, from the nuclear dilemma on the Korean Peninsula to maritime disputes that are so dangerous today. It is a privilege to have Dr. Prabhakar here today to speak on the theme so central to Herb York's life, the intersection of national security, cutting-edge science and technology, and what it means not only for today's generation, but for tomorrow's generation of scientists, engineers, and even social scientists, as represented by some of the students we have today. Through the generous support of our sponsors, Kratos, the UCSD Jacobs School of Engineering, and the Herb York family, I would first of all, before we begin, to introduce Rachel York, the daughter of Herb, to offer some personal reflections of him, and then have our UCSD Executive Vice Chancellor, Suresh Subramani, to introduce Dr. Prabhakar. So, Rachel?
Thank you, Ty. I'm so glad to be able to speak today at this event and so pleased that Dr. Prabhakar is here to deliver the third annual Herbert York Memorial Lecture. Dad was the founding chancellor of this university. We came in 1961, and he founded IGCC in 1988. He was particularly proud of IGCC, and he viewed it as a means to help the university contribute to international security and cooperation. The latter part of Dad's life was devoted to arms control and disarmament. And he was also particularly proud to be the ambassador to the Comprehensive Test Ban talks in Geneva under Carter. When I was little, we lived in Livermore, where Dad was the founding director of what we just called the RAD Lab, the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. My parents were just starting out, really. We had a little tract house, 1950s house, with orange crates for bedside tables. It was very calm. And then suddenly, our life changed dramatically when Sputnik went up on October 4th of 1957. Eisenhower was the president, and the new Secretary of Defense, Neil McElroy, was appointed only 5 days after Sputnik went up. He'd come from Procter & Gamble. When the flurry of events following Sputnik, Ernest Lawrence and James Killian suggested that they bring Dad in some high position in the Pentagon, an amorphous high position, where he could help build an in-house capability for coping with issues of high technology. As Dad described in his autobiography, Making Weapons and Talking Peace, the creation of the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, was the new secretary's first answer to Sputnik. McElroy's idea was to create an agency that would promote, control, and manage a variety of advanced research projects, including all those involving satellites, spaceflight, and missile defenses. So that was quite a big brief. Eisenhower announced ARPA's creation at the State of the Union speech in January of 1958, only 4 months after Sputnik went up, and Dad was appointed as the first chief scientist that March. He was only 37. He was barely 37. He recruited the rest of the initial technical staff, some dozens of scientists and engineers experienced in the relevant branches of high technology. Amidst all the intensity of dealing with the military, the inter-service rivalries, the government, the politics, the press, and a very alarmed public, there were lighter moments. This is a cartoon that was in the Baltimore Sun. I don't know if you can see it. This is Dad popping tranquilizers. It says, the official Washington Department of Explanation. There's a blind eagle with the motto, "We soothe." Nikita Khrushchev is the man in the moon, and Dad is saying, relax. There's a big Russian rocket, little American rocket. Their rockets are just twice as big, that's all. So, at his job, he was on Meet the Press, Face the Nation, explaining to a very alarmed public exactly what was happening and what they were going to do. He liked telling a story of a particular Senate hearing that he was at, where the senators wanted ARPA to do a project that Dad thought was especially outlandish. I don't know if you have to deal with these. Well, he couldn't tell the senators that he thought it was outlandish, so he just said the state of the art would not permit it. There was a senator who was rather doddery and dozy, and he sat up straight and he said, Dr. York, what did you just say? Dad said the state of the art won't permit it. The senator said, oh, I thought you said the state of New York. And on another occasion, that first ARPA spring, Senator Henry Jackson, who many of you may remember as Scoop, called Dad and asked for a favor for his good friend Jack Kennedy. He had a kid brother named Ted who wanted an expert to come talk to his law class club on space, and would Dad do it? Dad obliged, and that was the beginning of a friendly and rewarding relationship with Ted Kennedy. As a child, These were exciting days for me and for my sister. We used to go to the Pentagon and use it as our playground. I guess you can't do that now. We especially enjoyed running up the down escalator to the chagrin of the security guards, but Dad was number 3 in the Pentagon. So we were given a little bit of leeway. I got a little less leeway when one day I came home from elementary school and spotted a new red phone in Mom and Dad's bedroom. And in those days, phones were all wired in, and it was a very big deal to have a new phone. And so I picked it up, and there was no dial tone. And a rather lugubrious voice said, "What number are you calling, please?" And I knew to hang up. And Dad came home from the office. He says, "Rachel, did you pick up that red phone?" And of course, it was a hotline to the war room. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Suresh Subramani. Thank you very much.
Well, what can I say after that wonderful set of stories? You know, we often pride ourselves in what UCSD accomplished and so on, but I didn't know we had a role to play in DARPA, in the Pentagon, and so many other things. So it's wonderful to have that personal story. Thank you all for being here. This is, as Rachel said, the 3rd Herbert York Memorial Lecture. And we have, as you'll see, a fantastic person here, Arati Prabhakar, to talk about the things that DARPA is doing. And if you think about, you know, Rachel said it's what the state of art cannot accomplish or do at this point. That's basically what DARPA has been doing throughout its lifetime, and I hope she'll provide some excitement with the things that they're doing. It's really, I think it's remarkable that as part of this Herbert York Memorial Lecture, we are celebrating an individual who influenced UCSD as the first chancellor, who helped set up IGCC and DARPA. So in this sense, there's a confluence of interests, and it's really part of a big family, and it's wonderful to have you here, Arati, as part of the celebration. I hope also that during the time, Arati has been here many times before, but as we've talked about the things that are going on campus, I was trying to tell her how our faculty are involved and thanking her for DARPA funding, and she told me a few things that our faculty are doing that even I didn't know about. So you'll hear about it in the talk today. So they're better informed than we might be right in our backyard. But this goes to show that our faculty and students and staff are doing things in collaboration with DARPA and other agencies that are making a difference, and for this we really have to be thankful. Like the folks at DARPA, we have prided ourselves in being able to think outside the box, to kind of peer around corners, and while trying to anticipate new fields, UCSD has prided itself in really defining and creating new fields and taking them in new directions. So in this sense, we're very synergistic with what DARPA itself has been trying to do all of these years. I want to also say that our own Chancellor, Pradeep Khosla, as well as our Dean of Engineering, Al Paisano, as well as many other faculty and people in this room, have had intimate links with DARPA. They've either served on DARPA committees or been at DARPA itself. And so we see these connections continuing to grow, and I think as we look forward, we will have even more things to focus on. Collectively on this campus, for those of you who are not aware of the details of this, we have 17 DARPA awards that amount to about $26 million of research, and it spans the range of the campus, and there's even more to come. And in fact, what we're very excited about in recent times is that, you know, scientists here, people like Ralph Greenspan and Terry Sinofsky and others, have been working with DARPA in putting forward a plan that you know, was announced recently by President Obama as a BRAIN initiative, and this campus, as many of you know, has jumped on this right away to create a center for the BRAIN initiative on the campus, with many faculty in engineering and the rest of the campus coming together in ways that I hope will make a tremendous difference to this particular field. I also want to reach out to the people in the audience today. I'm delighted to see so many friends of UC San Diego as well as DARPA in the audience. DARPA has many other partners besides UCSD in this particular region. And I think in this sense, I want to extend my special thanks to Kratos Defense and Security Solutions, which is supporting the event that we're having today. My special thanks also goes to Dr. Eric DeMarco, who is the CEO of the company and the president of Kratos Unmanned Combat Aerial Systems, Vice Admiral Gerald Beeman, who made today's event really happen, and want to thank them for that. So without further ado, I want to just continue with the introduction of our speaker tonight. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Arati Prabhakar, who has been the director of DARPA for the past year or so. She has spent her entire career investing in world-class research at various institutions, focusing on engineers and scientists to create new technologies and businesses that really couldn't precisely be defined, but they've always looked out way ahead into the future and tried to define ways of allowing the best people and the best brains to come forward and take them there. Her first service to the national security was to the national security enterprise, started in 1986 when she joined DARPA as a program manager. And then she initiated and maintained a variety of programs in advanced semiconductor technology, as well as flexible manufacturing, and worked on a variety of demonstration projects to insert new semiconductor technology into military systems, working with the military. Then, as founding director of DARPA's Microelectronics Technology Office, she led a team of program managers whose efforts spanned many of these areas, including optoelectronics, infrared imaging, and nanoelectronics. In 1993, President Bill Clinton appointed her as director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, where she led a 3,000-person organization to work with companies across a variety of industries. So she's a fellow of the IEEE, a Texas Tech Distinguished Engineer, and a Caltech Distinguished Alumna. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Arati Prabhakar.
Thank you so much, Suresh. It's really great to be with all of you today. What I want to do today is share with you DARPA's mission, how we're thinking about it in the context of the world that we live in today, and I'd like to share some examples of the new technology capabilities that we're driving towards. But before I do all of that, I really wanted to step back and just say how pleased I was when Ty contacted me to ask if I would come give this lecture. First, because it's always wonderful to be at UCSD. You may have become immune to your surroundings, but what I find when I drive into La Jolla, every time I drive into this area, I just have this tremendous sense of freedom and expanding horizons. And I think, of course, it's the physical beauty, but it's also the intellectual climate, this very intense intellectual climate that you all have been able to create here. So it's always good to be here. But, you know, the particular pleasure of being asked to give this lecture, of course, is that it's a memorial to Herb York. And you honor him here as one of your founders. At DARPA, of course, we honor him as one of our founders. And that's where I'd like to start my presentation, is at the beginning. Rachel, you talked about Sputnik, and of course that was the triggering event for the creation of what was originally ARPA. Sputnik was a surprise in the United States. It's not clear it needed to be, but in fact it was a surprise. And then, as now, we understood that technology is a cornerstone of our national security. We were pretty clear we didn't want to suffer that kind of surprise again. And ARPA, now DARPA, was created specifically to have a mechanism to avoid that kind of technological surprise in the future. So we've been designed from the beginning to complement and augment, but to be outside of the military services investments in R&D, to live outside of the formal military requirements process, to scan the horizon and to look for the new opportunities. And very quickly, DARPA realized that the best way to prevent technological surprise is to create surprise, and over 5.5 decades, we've created quite a few surprises of our own. And these technology breakthroughs have both changed the way that we fight in the military context, but at the same time, the enabling technologies that have come from those efforts have changed how all of us live and work. So on the one hand, in 1991 in Desert Storm, when we were preparing to go into Baghdad, into a very heavily defended, very sophisticated integrated air defense system, we were going into a military mission that many people felt had huge risk that could lead to a terribly deep loss of life. That could turn into a mission with a great deal of attrition. What happened, in fact, largely because of the significant role of stealth technology, was that we were very quickly able to go in, take out the integrated air defenses, and over a period of time fly over 1,200 sorties with no loss of life, no loss of, everyone came back whole. That's a great example of a breakthrough technology changing outcomes. And at the same time, on the ground over the last few decades, as infrared night vision, as GPS-enabled navigation and guidance, and as communications technologies have become available to our soldiers and SEALs, that's what's allowed them to own the night. And then, of course, in our civilian lives, each of us, every single time that we do something as mundane but miraculous as check into a social networking site on our smartphone, of course, we're using so many of the same technologies that drove those military capabilities. And that interplay has always been very, very critical in DARPA's history. Now, every technology, every capability that I mentioned, of course, was achieved only through the closely knit efforts of a very wide technology community, a vibrant ecosystem that we have in this country. Almost every one of these technologies began with a research concept in a laboratory, very frequently in a university. Every one of these capabilities required the efforts of companies, large and small. For the military capabilities, our partners across the Defense Department and ultimately warfighters had to take those technologies and turn them into real fielded operational capabilities. So what did DARPA do in all of that? Our role throughout history has been to, throughout this history at least, has been to make the pivotal early investments that changed what was possible so that we could take big steps forward in capability. That's what we've done throughout our history, and that is very much our focus today as well. And for those of us who have the privilege of serving at DARPA today, actually the most exciting part of this chart is the blank space on the right-hand side. It's our responsibility, but also our tremendous privilege to make the investments today in which we aspire to stimulate the work that will lead to this class of breakthroughs for the next generation. So that is mission and history. And of course, our mission has not changed throughout this time. It remains very much the same. But the world in which we've been operating continues to change. And the environment today is neither the Cold War environment in which ARPA began, nor is it the intense period of two focused ground wars that we have just come through for over a decade in the Defense Department. And so when I came back to DARPA last summer, a year ago this summer, we took a little bit of time to step back and just ask the question about the major forces that shape the national security environment so that we could think about how we execute our core mission in this context. And let me just highlight the three major themes in our view at this point. The first simply has to do with the complexity of the national security challenge. I think about when I first came to DARPA in 1986, it was still very much Cold War. And while, in fact, the world was quite complex, at that time, we faced a monolithic, overwhelming existential threat to our security. And that was, of course, where all of our attention, virtually all of our attention and resources were focused. We're lucky not to have that particular threat to that degree today. But the world that we live in is one that is very complex. And the actions and the directions of nation states continue to play a very important role. It's critical to think through what Iran might do or what North Korea might do. That's something I think we actually have the institutional mechanisms to do in the Defense Department and the State Department. And that continues to be vitally important. But of course, alongside that have developed a full spectrum of other types of national security threats, where I would characterize the other end of the spectrum as being really the chronic national security threats that emerge from networked malignant actors. And often these are linkages between nation states and terrorist activity and other illicit activity, money laundering, drug trafficking. And those links themselves, of course, are as old as the hills. What is new in the environment that we're facing today is that there is a liquid marketplace for those kinds of transactions and connections to happen. And that creates this continuous conflict that we live in today and that we think will be part of the future as far as we can see out today. The second major theme that defines the environment in which we work has to do with technology. And here you are in San Diego. You all live this every single day. We live today in a world where some of the most amazing technology capabilities, networking, advanced semiconductors, new biological technologies. These are technologies that are no longer solely driven by the United States. These advanced capabilities many times are now available in the form of catalog parts that are accessible to everyone around the world. And that global availability of technology has lifted living standards around the world. It has advanced humanity in many ways, but it does have another edge, which is a concern from a national security perspective. And in particular, when I think about how we still operate in the defense enterprise, I think this is an area of great concern, because our processes for taking technology and turning it into operational capability still behave as if we have all the time in the world, because no one else really has these technologies. And of course, that's no longer the reality that we're living in. So understanding how we move and how we operate and how we think about technology in this globally connected environment with technology widely available around the world is another key theme for DARPA. The third major threat, or the third major area of thinking about national security has to do with resources. And, I'm not talking here about the current decline in defense budgets as we come through this period of 2 wars. I'm not even talking about sequestration and all the other problems that we deal with on a daily basis in Washington. They're real. We manage through them. I'm really talking here about the question of whether we're at the beginning of a structural shift in how we allocate resources to the task of national security in this country. Just given demographics, just given the continuing rise in healthcare costs and society's current inclinations to allocate resources to those directions as opposed to national security, I think it's possible that we're going to live in a future where in the next years and decades we have far fewer resources to do the business of national security than we've had in the past. And this has huge implications for our job, because it means that this leading edge technology community in national security is going to have to figure out how to bring innovation to the job of thinking about cost. Now, I come from this community, so this is an indictment of myself, I think, as much as anyone else. But I think for many of us, when we've heard people talk about affordability, and I think for many of us it induces a coma-like state because it sounds really boring and it doesn't sound like what exciting technology is all about. But today we are at a point where it will take deep innovation to create a future where we build real systems rather than just building PowerPoint. We are already at the point where we have systems and capabilities that are so expensive that there are many things we're not doing because we simply have allocated all the resources that are available to a few choices that we have made. So I think it is time for a real wake-up call to our community to think in fresh ways about cost. Those are some broad themes. I'll talk about some of the ways. I'd like to give you some examples and maybe bring to life some of the approaches that we're using at DARPA. What I thought I'd do is talk about 3 different areas and give you some examples of some of the specific programs. Let me start with this environment of the networked threat, the continuous conflict that we face. Many technical aspects of how we can deal with and get mastery over this particular region of the threat spectrum. But I wanted to start particularly today with cyber. This is the classic example of a new domain that is so different from the kinds of threats that we've faced in the past that I think institutionally we're not particularly well positioned to deal with it. But it is a threat that is a capability that everyone from individuals to full nation state capabilities are able to inflict damage on the U.S. economy and on military capabilities today, to put us in an uncomfortable position. And that's really where we are today. So if you think about cyber at the moment, there's a huge concern grappling with policy issues, significant policy issues around cybersecurity, concerns about the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure, concerns about the intellectual property of our companies, concerns in the defense community about the vulnerability of our commercially based network systems that we use for communications, and then even beyond that, concerns about the security of our military platforms, which are very information rich in the environment that we live in today. By and large, I think a lot of the complexity in this area arises from the fact that the cyber domain has so many different facets. Yes, it's the internet, but it is every device that connects to it. It's all the software that makes it run. It's the networking. It is the users, the human beings that use all that complexity and connectivity to great effect. And every aspect of that complex network is part of the surface that can be and is being attacked and exploited. So today, just to think about it in some broad categories, one of the issues is that the architectures that we employ for information systems are very easy to attack. Just something as simple as clicking on a PDF that might be attached to an email that you get, that can be a way that an attacker can get onto your system. We hear a lot about how the human beings are really the problem. And of course, as human beings, we observe that the problem is that all the attempts to keep us secure also hamper our ability to use the power of the technology. I know when I started at DARPA about 1.25 years ago, I showed up and it seemed that I needed to invent 15 uncrackable passwords, each of which was unique. On that day. And of course, this is what drives people to writing yellow stickies and leaving them in places where they can be found. So how do we really break that trade-off between the usability of the technology and the user's security? Beyond that, the supply chain, the components on which our networks and technologies, our information technologies are built, are globally sourced components. Of course, many of the physical components trace back to semiconductors that are overwhelmingly built not in the United States but around the world, the majority now in Asia. So we are not in a position where we can imagine that we exert direct control over the supply chain. And then finally, it's not just the networks that we all use every day in communicating and using the internet. It's also, as I said before, our embedded information systems. The little picture in the bottom right, if you look carefully, is a speedometer that shows a vehicle going at 140 miles an hour. But then if you look really carefully, you'll notice it's still in park. And the reason is it's been hacked. It's actually been hacked by a UCSD researcher, Stefan Savage, has great research in this area that really put a light on how vulnerable our embedded systems are. So many aspects of the problem. What are we trying to do about it? DARPA has a collection of programs that are tackling each of these broad areas. They range from work on introducing heterogeneity into our networks, thinking about how we can work on encrypted data to improve security, thinking about changing the user piece of the security equation by having biometrics that don't require novel devices, thinking about how we can use these COTS-based, these systems that are built out of commercially available technology, how can we analyze them more fully in an automated way so that we know what we've got, even though we can't control the whole supply chain. And then finally, can we start scaling? Is there a way to scale formal methods that allow us to build systems that are correct by construction? So you'll notice there's not a silver bullet here. This is a collection of very deep, hard technology areas which collectively, as they migrate into commercial practice, I think will start moving cybersecurity to a place not where we are invulnerable, but a place where we can get on with our business because we have a reasonable foundation of cybersecurity. And I think that will be a dramatic shift. So one example of some of the work that we're doing at DARPA. Let me shift gears and think thinking about not the this networked threat, but a little bit more focused, thinking about what the Defense Department has, I think, traditionally viewed its role as for many, many decades, which is getting ready for the next major conflict, especially thinking in terms of a potential sophisticated peer adversary in the future, getting ready for that so that we can win if we have to go to war, but hoping that in the process we deter that conflict. So again, let me just pick a multifaceted topic. Let me just pick one particular area that we're focusing some of our investment today, and that has to do with the business of how we control the electromagnetic spectrum. You know, radar, of course, has come a long way since it helped win the Battle of Britain, but in those intervening decades, we have come to really like controlling the electromagnetic spectrum during periods of conflict. We are utterly dependent on it for the communication systems that we need, for the radar that tells us what's going on, for the electronic warfare capabilities that allow us to shape what the adversary is seeing. But that period of having that phenomenal edge in the electromagnetic spectrum is very much at risk today. And when I returned to DARPA after nearly 2 decades out of the national security enterprise, one of the things I was most surprised to see was how rapidly others around the world, friends and foes, had been able to advance their electronic warfare capabilities simply by using globally available component technologies that have been commercialized for many wonderful commercial applications, but can, you know, lead to catalog parts like FPGAs today that can do phenomenal things in a little bit of silicon. These other players around the world have used that commercial technology base and have been very quick to integrate it into electronic warfare systems. This just shows you an EW pod that's you know, an example of the kinds of systems that we see. And when you peel one of these open, what you find is that they are built out of, you know, a variety of commercially available components. The vast majority are from U.S. headquartered companies, but, you know, sort of so what? They're built around the world and they're available around the world, and people are, you know, have been very smart about just using them. That has created a threat environment and a potential future threat environment that has tremendous diversity. Good on the other side. On our side, how are we doing? Well, it turns out we're sort of in the inverse situation because our systems, many of them date back many, many decades. As an example, the EW systems that are on a carrier date back literally to the 70s. As we try to build new systems today, it tends to take us many years, often decades, and it costs us billions of dollars because in each case we're doing a unique redesign. So the question, so, you know, both things have happened, diversity in the threat environment and predictability on our side. Neither is a good idea, and we need to find a way not just to catch up, but to leapfrog dramatically ahead of what's happening around the world in a way that regains an advantage for our side. So how are we going to do that? Again, a collection of programs at DARPA, a set of activities first that allow us to understand what's happening in real time in the electromagnetic spectrum, to understand the signaling that's going on, the use of the spectrum, but also its intent. After understanding that, having the ability to generate a real-time response that shapes, again, shaping what the adversary sees in a way that reflects the picture we want them to see rather than what's really happening. And then when you do all of that, at the end of the day, you do need the hardware capability to do that kind of adaptation on the fly. And if this first chain that's shown here today leads to an ability in that little diagram where today we build a system at a particular frequency with a particular waveform to design the next system when we see a new waveform or a new frequency in the field requires going back to the lab. That can be this enormously long cycle. What we're aiming for in the future is hardware that allows us to take what we're learning, to shape the response, but then to implement it in hardware in which we push the digital interface, continue to push it farther and farther towards the antenna to give us the kind of real-time flexibility that allows us to cover that entire space literally in real time in the field. Now, here we are in a part of the world that knows a lot about wireless technology, and of course there's a long history of amazing commercial capabilities and industries that have been built out of what we've done in the last few decades with wireless technologies. We similarly think that there will be great opportunities that come out of this militarily driven problem as we push into the next generation. So those are some thoughts and examples about work that we're doing as we think about the networked threat, as we think about deterring and then defeating, if needed, a peer adversary, sophisticated adversary in some future. Let me shift gears and for my third area, talk a little bit more about foundations for the future, because the enabling technology investments that we've made at DARPA, again, always driving to a national security objective, those enabling technology investments historically, I think, have been a major part of how we have had impact, and they've been this interplay between those investments and what happens commercially, the industries that grow out of that, which then become capability on which we can draw for national security. That dynamic and interplay is something that has been critical in the past. Today we continue to pursue new dimensions in material science, in information technology, in microsystems. But in addition to those three areas, there's a fourth chapter that I think will be written in this period of time at DARPA for enabling technologies, and that is a chapter about biology as technology. And I'd like to just share with you a handful of examples of things that we're doing in that area. Let me start with some work that we're doing with the objective to outpace the spread of infectious disease. To really get ahead of a rapidly moving bug, we need to do two things. One is we need the ability to have very rapid but specific diagnosis so that we can actually see the spread of disease as it moves. Once we've done that, the next part of the job is to get rapidly develop and deploy the prophylaxis that prevents that spread from human to human. This spans a whole variety of technologies. On the diagnostic side, let me show you some work that we've been doing recently. Today, if you want a specific diagnosis of exposure to a disease, so for example, a few years ago, my family and I had the misfortune to contract H1N1 while we were traveling. I should say we think we had H1N1 because when we got to a clinic, the doctor said, well, you know, it's going to take too long to take your blood sample and put it into an environmentally protected container and FedEx it to the lab and wait for a few days to get the results back. And by the way, the labs are overwhelmed right now anyway, so we think this is what you have. Take this medicine, go away, and hope you get better. And we did, and it was all fine. But that's actually doesn't help you figure out what's happening with the spread of disease because of the cost and the complexity of getting that answer. One of the things that we're developing today is the ability to have a very small, locally held device that would give you that kind of rapid, specific diagnosis, but much more rapidly. Some of this work has been done at Caltech, and you'll see the performer's 6-year-old son is going to show you how it works.
And this is how you do slip chip experiment. First you get the sample.
It's fake blood, for the record.
Then you put it in a hole. Then you cover it with the top. Then you wait until it goes to the end.
You can see the blood flowing across on these channels.
Then you slip. And now it's done.
So what he's done is created thousands of individual wells. Each of those wells was preloaded with the reagents needed to make the analysis. And all of the work that's done in a laboratory gets done right there in that little chip. And for those of you who've worked in microfluidics, one of the things I really love is there's no off-screen power and pumps and all the other things going on. It's really a self-contained unit. And I think this is a great example of sometimes technology lets you do really complex things, and that's what matters. This is an example where really sophisticated technology lets you make something so simple that a soldier in a field in a stressful environment could actually take that, use that kind of a device. So that's part one on the diagnostic side. In fact, we've some of the earlier work, not this work, but some of the earlier diagnostics work is currently being used in Saudi Arabia. You've probably heard about the MERS virus that is highly lethal, has not yet evolved to spread human to human, but it's a classic case of a situation where we need to understand the spread of that disease, and we've been able to help the Saudis with some diagnostics technology that I think will be helpful in that regard. On the right-hand side, the prophylaxis side, we're doing some very interesting work using RNA techniques both to enhance conventional vaccines, but also we hope to develop the ability for immediate but temporary prophylaxis that can bridge the gap to the time of the effectiveness of a vaccine, or for our special operators, for example, who on short notice need to go to a region of the world where they'll be exposed to a particular kind of threat. It would give them the short period of immunity that is so necessary for their health and survival. So one example of turning biology into technology, a related area, but with, I think, a very different set of potential applications, really has to do with synthetic biology. This is a community that for many years has had a vision of what's going to be possible as we learn to engineer microorganisms to enhance or to change what they're able to produce. Of course, we make some pharmaceuticals this way, some specialty chemicals have emerged, people are working towards economic fuels. But beyond that, people have imagined many more interesting things that are going to be possible as we really learn how to do this. Now, unfortunately, reality has been a little bit less exciting, I think, than that vision, simply because the examples of what we're able to do today, they're very powerful individual examples, but they are each very, very costly, lengthy undertakings that really represent still fairly modest changes in terms of the complexity of the genetic modification that's going on. The goal of our Living Foundries program at DARPA is to create the tools and the techniques and the communities that move synthetic biology from where it is today to really fulfill that vision by being able to bring that kind of engineering practice to this particular field. Let me finish with a third area of biology that I think is holding tremendous promise for advances today, one that we've been talking a little bit about the things that you're doing here at UCSD, and this is brain function research. At DARPA, a lot of our work began with concerns about wounded warriors. One of our program managers was an Army doctor who came back from theater driven to create a better prosthetics capability. He did that in a program that did two things. One was to develop a very sophisticated robotic arm. The other part of the program was doing the brain function research to understand where motor control was happening in the brain and how it operated. From animal models and animal research that we did, and as the prosthetic arm was developed, over the last year or so, we've been able now to have the first human trials. And the video I'm going to show you is a woman named Jan. She's a longtime quadriplegic who lives in Pittsburgh. She saw an ad that said that the University of Pittsburgh was looking for volunteers to do this research. And Jan volunteered to have a small array placed on the surface of her brain. At the end of the surgery, she has 2 ports on her head, and from that you'll see that that's where the leads come off of. The signals from her brain are being used to directly control this robotic arm, and after you'll see what Jan is now able to do.
5 months after the surgery, we came back to see whether she would be able to control the robotic arm with nothing but her thoughts. They plugged her brain into the computer, and this is what we saw.
I can move it up and straight down and left and right and diagonally. I can close it and open it, and I can go forward and back.
That is just the most astounding thing I've ever seen. Can we shake hands?
Sure.
No, really.
Yeah.
Like, come right over here?
Yes, you come over
Okay.
there. Let me grasp your hand there. There we go.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And I can do a fist bump if you'd like.
That's amazing. What are you doing, Jan? What's going on in your mind as you're moving this arm around? What are you thinking?
Okay, the best way to explain it is raise your arm.
Uh-huh.
Go. Now,
Right.
what did you think about when you did that?
Well, not very much. I do it all the time.
Exactly. It's automatic.
Is that hard work? Are you having to concentrate?
No, it was hard work getting there. I struggled greatly to go up and down at the beginning. Now up and down is so easy, I don't even think about it. Side to side, don't even think about it.
Just like
that.
your arms used to.
Yes.
So, you know, to me, the aha moment was the recognition, the realization that she's not controlling each individual bit of movement, but that it's a natural, a graceful, intuitive thing for her to do. And of course, the implications for prosthetics are significant, but as well, it opens the door to allow us to start thinking about very different ways that human brains can interact with highly complex systems, something that's at the core of how each of us works and interacts with the world, and is certainly what warfighters have to do their jobs. And I think that's, you know, that's the kind of thing that tells us that we're at the beginning of a long and very productive period in brain function research, of which this work is only one small piece. So, you know, if you're like me, your reaction to that, my reaction certainly was wow, followed by wow. And so, you know, I think the kinds of questions that come up when we push the limits on these kinds of new technologies, I just want to take a moment and talk about how we think about the broader societal implications of this work. I think we frequently are in the position of seeing into these new arenas first because of the nature of our work. The societal issues are very wide-ranging. You can imagine where brain function research raises all kinds of interesting questions, safety and security issues around synthetic biology, privacy issues around big data, space policy issues around some of the space robotics work that we're doing. So very different issues in each of these areas. We see two roles for DARPA. First and foremost, it's actually our job to push these technology frontiers for our nation. And so we have to make sure that we don't shy away from technology areas simply because, you know, someone might write about it or it's going to raise questions. This is our job to investigate these areas for the country. But part and parcel of having that job as well is to also a role in raising some of these broader societal issues and engaging a broader discussion. It's not our job to decide what the answer is. In fact, I don't really want to live in a society in which technologists and national security make up answers to these questions, but we do think it's important to raise and engage a broader community. So what do we actually do? First and foremost, our projects, our research projects, are always done with a full understanding of what the laws and the regulations are that apply. That's something we just take very, very seriously, and usually that is not the hard part. The much more interesting questions have to do with how we would choose to use these technology capabilities in the future, and for that we often will engage experts in various ways. One example is in the synthetic biology area. We've put together an expert panel with a variety of different perspectives. And these people have helped our program managers in that area just think about these different aspects of the technology as they develop the program. The expert panel has come to program reviews, which I think is particularly important because when they are part of that research community, that means that graduate students who are working on those contracts just understand that we're going to ask these questions, that we should all, in the technical community, we should all be engaged in that business of asking these questions. And on many occasions, we find that as we ask those kinds of questions, there are technology levers that can be pulled that can help. At the end of the day, these are fundamentally society's choices, and not all problems are going to be solved by technology alone, but I do think that as we're smarter about it, we can play a role in getting us to a better place. So let me finish where I began, which is with DARPA itself. For the outside world, we aim to deliver a host of breakthrough technologies that we hope will have tremendous impact in the years ahead. But inside of DARPA, we also recognize that an important role for leadership in the agency is to continue to make sure that the DARPA engine itself it stays humming in this very robust fashion. That engine is driven by a few key factors, and the first one has to do with our program managers. We bring in technical program managers from across the wide technology community. We have university folks who rotate through for a few years. We'll have people who've left companies. We have people from other parts of government, not-for-profit labs. These folks come to DARPA for 3 to 5 years. We pick them, of course, for their technical depth and their technical judgment, but also for their drive and their passion about changing the world, their ability to have the dynamic range to go from bits and atoms all the way to what difference does it make and how can we actually make a big impact. We spend a lot of time in management at DARPA trying to make sure that we enable these folks to get a lot done in the short period of time that they're in the agency. And the way they do their job is not to sit in their office in Arlington, Virginia, but to get out and to actively engage that broad technical community, to get on a plane and to go visit people in their labs and to speak with them. It's actually remarkably easy to reach people who already know about DARPA, that know to watch for our announcements and know to come knock on our door, but it is so important that we get out and talk to the people who may not know about DARPA or may not know that what they're doing is relevant to us. So those are some of the core concepts that make the DARPA activity really thrive. And when we get those pieces working right, it allows us to reinforce our culture, which is about driving for off-scale impact and being willing to take enormous technical risk to reach for that impact. And it's really the understanding that it's a deep responsibility, but also a phenomenal privilege to get to do this work for the future of our country. And when I hear and read about DARPA's history in the early years, I really feel that if I was able to time travel back to Herb York's 1958 ARPA, I have a feeling I would feel right at home, because I think many of these cultural elements really do trace all the way back to the beginning. And I like to think that if Herb York could come walk our halls at DARPA in 2013, that he too would see that same spirit and would feel right at home with us. So thanks very much for the chance to be here today. I'm really interested to hear your questions and comments.
About 15 minutes?
Yeah, whatever you'd like.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions. Can I ask that if you put up your hands, and you can only ask one question, and we want to keep it as short as possible because we only have 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to be short too.
Over here.
So I want to take up on the point that where you stopped, and that is the new talent and new generation. Now, for many of us who go back to the days where DARPA, before midterms were there, and there was long-term commitment.
Before what was there?
DARPA project midterms and
yeah.
the short time schedules. But in last 10 years or so, there's actually a generation of faculty in my department and others who are actually quite unaware of DARPA. I mean, of course, they all know DARPA, but they have not been engaged because that generation I would call a lost generation, just like the Chinese cultural wars or something.
Yeah.
But is there a way to bring them in and they have actually quite shifted away from DARPA style of proposals and writing. So I'm posing a question for which I have no answer. I mean, just...
Yeah, so, DARPA has had different areas of emphasis over different periods. I very much see what you're talking about, a generation of, period of time during which a lot of young faculty or people who are graduate students in that period didn't have the experience of DARPA that pervaded the disciplines, that I grew up in and the time that I went through. I think there's been a lot of work at DARPA since that period to directly re-engage the university community broadly. And I think that I think we've made reasonable progress. We're never really done with that. I want to overlay on top of that something that I think is worth noting, which is that I think it is still the case that if you walk through the halls of most computer science departments or electrical engineering, material science departments, that most of the people that you run into will know DARPA. Many, many of them will have worked with DARPA. That's not really true in many of the other areas of science and technology. And biology in particular is one where I find that we are actively going out and trying to engage a community that has typically been funded by other agencies for different purposes. We want to build on top of that science base to go do some of the things in the DARPA world today. And so, who we work with and the areas where we think there are DARPA scale impact opportunities will always be changing, and I think that's an overlay to the phenomenon that you're describing. So help us continue to encourage people, please, because I think it is a vital and important part of our community.
You mentioned that when ARPA was founded, it benefited considerably from the Sputnik crisis and the sense of urgency that led to funding for ARPA. I wonder if you would comment on the current budget situation. You alluded to the constraints that come from the pressure of other social priorities, and you might have mentioned the revision of strategic thinking within the Defense Department, the concern for bureaucratic maintenance of the three services. My question is, are you feeling constraints on the budgetary sources that you have to do all these things that you're setting out to do?
So, DARPA's current budget is $2.6 billion. That was what our budget was in fiscal 13. One day we'll find out what our budget is in fiscal 14 that we're already in. That $2.6 billion number was post-sequestration. And so, first, just the facts, DARPA's budget has declined in real terms about 20% over the last 5 years. I can find no evidence that anyone was gunning for DARPA. This is simply budget erosion in a horribly fierce budget environment that we live in across government, especially for discretionary spending, especially for defense. And I think that environment is a fact of life. What I find when I talk to my management through the Pentagon and all the way up to the president that I think is critical is first an understanding that DARPA's role is as important as it ever has been, given the uncertainty that we face going forward and the role of technology in national security today. I also find very strong support on both sides of the aisle in Congress, and both of those are critically important. So I do feel very grateful for the support that we have. It's just a fact of life that we're going to continue to be struggling to maintain the resource level. So on the one hand, I will continue to fight to make sure we get the resources that we need to do our job. But on the other hand, we're going to go execute the heck out of every dollar that we get. And I think because of our 5.5-decade legacy of having delivered, we are fortunate to have tremendous support despite the environment.
We still have about 5 minutes. Is anyone?
Mine is a general question. Am I coming through?
I can hear you.
Okay. I think the slide before this one, or maybe two before, you talked about DARPA's DARPA's engaging in technology even in uncomfortable territory. What is uncomfortable territory?
Uncomfortable territory is when one of my program managers says, well, what if the Washington Post says something about what we're doing? And I say to that program manager, this happens fairly routinely, is I say, well, let's start with what we think is the right thing to do, and then let's figure out how to go do that, and let's make sure that we communicate it as clearly as we can. And then let's just not worry about what people say, because I think we don't want to be in a position where we're reacting, especially in the blogosphere environment in which we live. So that's what I really meant by uncomfortable. And we do find ourselves making uncomfortable choices about where we invest. But the discomfort comes from seeing a technological opportunity, seeing what it could do for national security, but recognizing that it will have potentially very serious other societal implications. Those are things we actually just wrestle with all the time.
At the back.
Thank you. I wonder if you could provide a few examples other than Sputnik of disruptive technological surprise that did not come out of DARPA and what might have been different in the management of that technology development.
Well, I mean, history has enormous numbers of those kinds of examples, and that predate DARPA by quite a bit. And I should also say that as proud as I am of DARPA's legacy, I think it's also important to recognize that we've been doing our work during an extraordinary period of technological supremacy in the United States. So, none of this happens in a vacuum. But I think maybe your core question is about how those kinds of big breakthroughs happen. And if that's where you were going, I think, really it seems to me the common element is the ability of an individual to see a different future and drive to it. And that seems simple, but we live in institutional organizations that really drive against that all the time. And creating the space, in my case, creating the space for my program managers to be able to think in an open way and to not feel fettered is so core to them being able to do their job. And if I look across history, it seems to me that the big advances have come from people who found that mental space.
Taking on DARPA hard challenges has to allow many failures, maybe many more failures than successes. How do you set the overall expectations for success rate? Is it 1% or 20%? How do you manage that?
Yeah, so failure is part and parcel of reaching for things that are big enough to make a real impact. By the way, with respect to DARPA Hard, I always tell my program managers that if they can think of something that has DARPA scale impact, but it's really easy, we should do all of those first, because really it's about impact. That is really the only thing we care about. Now, unfortunately, it turns out that after you do the first couple of things that are sort of easy, if you really want to have impact, you almost always end up taking often very significant risk. So how do we set expectations? What I say to my managers and what I say on Capitol Hill as well is that the way we manage risk is the way anyone would manage risk, which is we create a portfolio of investments, knowing full well that perhaps many of them will fail, but we're creating the portfolio knowing that some of them, and we really can't predict in advance, but some of them have the potential for phenomenal impact. And, just as in a financial portfolio, that's what pays the bill for the entire range of investments. And one of the things that really struck me, when I was coming back to DARPA a little over a year ago, former Defense Secretary Bill Perry said to me, "Who do you think was the best DARPA director?" And I thought back across 19 directors, and what struck me was that there really wasn't just one golden period at DARPA. Consistently over many, many decades, this enterprise has been able to generate important breakthroughs, and I think it is because of that portfolio methodology. That's the practical answer to how we do it. I think we have the enormous luxury of being able to take risk and being able to fail. People that need to support us give us that room simply because of the fact that we have established that track record. I think it's very hard to start today and to have, people have to give you patience and resources, and those are hard things to get today. So we feel very fortunate to be given that kind of long rope still.
So we have time for one last question at the back.
What's the process that you use to prioritize, and do you have black budget items?
Yeah, we certainly do have a portion of our activity that is classified. How we prioritize. The DARPA process, first of all, we don't set out to cover the waterfront or be comprehensive. We're a projects agency, not a laboratory or an institution. And the way we assemble our portfolio is driven by program managers. We expect our program managers to go out in the world, understand where technology opportunities are, understand what the hard national security problems are, and from understanding that directly from the people engaged in those enterprises, we expect our program managers to craft potentially high-impact DARPA programs. Within each of our 5 technology offices, that program manager works with their management, crafts a program, and if it seems to offer high potential and be reasonably aligned with where the office thought it was going strategically, then the office elects to allocate resources to it. And because our programs are finite, every year there's available resource to start new programs, something you simply can't do unless you stop old programs. So we make sure that we have that discipline to make sure that there are resources available. So from a management perspective, I really view my job and my office director's job as being responsible for having a portfolio that we look at and say, there are some huge, high potential, big bets here, but we've also balanced our risk. We haven't put all of our eggs in the cyber basket, for example, but we have distributed where we are looking for the big impact opportunities.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank
so
you.
it's so I wanted to thank Dr. Prabhakar for such a wonderful presentation, and to know that from Herb York to today, that DARPA is in such wonderful, capable hands as we go forward. Thank you very much.